So this afternoon's, the first panel is entitled Body and Land. And the three speakers are Wayde Compton, Cheryl Foggo, and Prud'homme Cranford. I'll read the bios all at the start so that then we can just dive into the discussion. Yes. No bios?
No, not on mine, please.
No Wayne bio?
No Wayne bio, but thank you.
Is the saying of name sufficient?
Name is great.
Can people read bios? Do you want? I'll just read like a line or two, okay? This is the ritual. So, Wayde first. 3 of Wayde Compton's books have been finalists for the City of Vancouver Book Award, and the Outer Harbour won it in 2015. In 2002, Compton co-founded the Hogan's Alley Memorial Project, an organization devoted to the public memory of Vancouver's historical Black community. And he's a member of the Northeast False Creek Stewardship Group, as well as Director-at-Large of the Hogan's Alley Society. He's also the Program Director of the Creative Writing and Continuing Studies program at Simon Fraser University, where he administrates the Writers' Studio. So Wayde is here on my immediate left. To my next left is Cheryl Foggo. Cheryl Foggo is a descendant of the Black pioneers of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and is an award-winning writer who has been published and produced extensively in multiple genres. John Ware Reimagined won the 2015 Writers Guild of Alberta Gwen Ferris Ringwood Award for Drama. In 2014, Cheryl co-produced Alberta's first Black Canadian theatre series with Ellipsis Tree Collective Theatre Company. She's currently in production with the National Film Board of Canada on a documentary film, John Ware Reclaimed, due in the fall of 2018. And I believe a run of her play, John Ware Reimagined, just finished in Edmonton just yesterday, right? Sunday. Prud'homme Cranford, who does not want to be named, is a fantastic Indigenous nerd and assistant professor of Indigenous literatures in the Department of English, as well as affiliated faculty in the International Indigenous Studies program here at the University of Calgary. Critical and creative work can be found in various publications, including the Southern Literary Journal, Louisiana Folklife, Undead South. The list is she's published a whole lot of in a whole lot of places, a whole lot of wonderful things in a lot of places. Her first book is Smoked Mullet Cornbread Crawdad Memory, published by MEP in 2012, and it won the first book award in poetry from the Native Writers Circle of the Americas. Her second book, Miscegenation Round Dance, Poème Historique, is under review and revision. All right, would you please give the panel a round?
Thanks so much to Marissa and Suzette for inviting me here. This has been really wonderful. I feel like I should do this at least once or twice a year, just for the soul. I'm going to read from an essay that's sort of still developing, but I'll read bits from it, and it's called Diversity and Affect. So recently, social media has delivered to us a relentless cascade of stories and images of Black death, detainment, abuse, and resistance. We've seen many stories emerge from the details of police killings of people such as Ayanna Jones, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Rakia Boyd, Renisha McBride, Eric Garner, John Crawford, Eric Harris, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and here in Canada, Abdiraham Abdi in Ottawa. I say these names and leave out so many others only because these are the stories that came to me, but the list from which they're drawn is woefully longer. We've also seen a number of videos of racial profiling that didn't lead to a death, but nonetheless show us directly what it is like to be targeted. For example, and this is from a couple years back, one in which a young black student was waiting to see a college counselor and had security called on him for waiting quietly in a chair, which the counselor regarded as itself some kind of harassment. You can find that on YouTube. Nor is any of this specific to the USA, as we've seen with the recent controversy about carding in Toronto and our own histories here in Canada of police repression of black and Indigenous people. Nor do I think what is being documented is any sort of uptick in the number of such incidents. I feel quite certain that the reason we're hearing more often and more vividly about such repression is because of new technologies, namely Twitter, Facebook, and smartphone video. We're merely seeing more of what has always gone on. That matters, and it makes a difference. It presents opportunities and gives us a chance to speak back and to reconsider this undercurrent of violence and racism that endures in North American society. For me, though, in particular, within this blizzard of documentation of repression, one small statement rang out and stayed with me and is the source for this talk I'm giving now. So on Twitter, the American novelist Matt Johnson, who was my teacher once, posted this short statement during the protests after Eric Garner's death. Johnson tweeted, "I just explained to my 8-year-old son that many white cops are petrified of black males, so at times his survival will depend on calming them." Fun. What Johnson describes here is a commonplace of black childhood. The euphemism for this genre of event is the talk, sardonically echoing the birds and the bees talk of general society. But this talk is the one black parents give to black children, and with some variations, it is as Johnson describes it. You must give it when the child is old enough to be seen as a threat, which in his case is 8 years old, when he decided it needed to be told. It's a pragmatic lesson in survival rather than an abstract rumination on race or society or justice. It's a desperate message, one you don't want to have to pass on, but must. It is a genre born of terror. So here are some quotations that describe the message communicated in the talk from several different black parents to their children, as reported by them, taken from an article by Jasmine Hughes. So these are different ones that different black parents have said to their children. Interact with police as little as possible. Get stopped for a traffic violation, use your Sunday school manners. Keep your hands where they can be seen, and above all else, do not argue. Ask the police permission before you reach for your license. Ask for permission to get your insurance card and registration out of the glove box. Don't be aggressive. Police usually work in groups of 2. If you see one, assume there is one you cannot see. 9 times out of 10, people will believe the police over believing you. If a cop hits you, don't fight back. Hope that someone will notice and say something. You answer their questions if they ask you with yes sir and no ma'am. Unless it is incriminating, then you exercise your right to be silent. Don't talk back. Don't even slouch. Be polite. No sudden movements. Don't give him a reason, because these cops will shoot you and not think twice about it. And this is from a different article by Janine Amber. If you are stopped by a cop, do what he says, even if he's harassing you, even if you didn't do anything wrong. Let him arrest you, memorize his badge number, and call me as soon as you get to the precinct. Keep your hands where he can see them. Do not reach for your wallet. Do not grab your phone. Do not raise your voice. Do not talk back. And this from an article by Ron Thomas. Be pleasant, follow instructions, move slowly, keep your hands visible at all times, get permission from the officer before you do anything. So as I said, there's nothing surprising here for black families. This is routine, though it's a shock for each child to hear it, but it goes on as it has gone on for generations. And so, just I'll quickly mention the version of the talk that I got when I was a kid was a Vancouver version of it. So my father is from Texas and moved to Vancouver in the 1950s. And so he grew up under those conditions, but I think he realized Vancouver is a curious place. So my dad had this method of, for some reason, this is a Vancouver version of anti-black racism that we grew up with. This seemed to happen often. We were walking in the street, a white guy would be walking towards us, and as he passed us, or just behind us, would whisper epithets, so the N-word, and just sort of in passing, and always whispering in this weird way, right? And so my dad had developed this thing where he would, when that happened, he would wheel around, stick his hand out, and say, "Hi, my name's Levi, what's your name?" and sort of forced them to, and they would shake his hand, and then they would chat for a bit, and then he'd be on his way. And he said to me, the thing about Vancouverites is they're just as racist as people in Texas, but they're also extremely polite. Force them to decide between which one they're going to go with. They'll go with politeness out of just kind of automatic response, right? And I saw him do this many times, and it always worked. And I later learned there's a term for it, which is non-complimentary behavior, right? Is that if somebody's being aggressive that way and you're aggressive back, they're ready for that, because that's what they expected, really, right? But if you switch it up in this way that's completely unexpected, they're discombobulated and sort of, for a moment, very confused. That was my dad's version of what Vancouver was like. Almost like a flip side of that. So here I think it's useful to turn to the philosophical concept of affect, a term developed by Spinoza and elaborated upon by Deleuze and Guattari. So in brief, it's a descriptor of bodily experience as opposed to intellectual experience, and a way of thinking about direct experiences of sensation that preempt or precede or otherwise lie outside abstract thinking. So what's useful to me in this concept is the way that it helps us identify elements of racialization in certain situations and events. What the talk essentially means to do, and what repression brings, is an affective response to certain interactions. Right? So a racially charged moment has affective subtext, elements of the experience that happen in the bodies of those involved, rather than necessarily in their words, or even in their own mental analysis of what's happening. And so, one of these incidents, there's a story of a caregiver, so a professional caregiver of an autistic man. I think this was in Florida, right? So he was a counselor, a professional counselor, and his client had a toy plane or something like that, and he was sitting in the middle of the street, and somebody had called in that he had a gun. So the police showed up, and so this counselor who's black, who's caregiver for this man, is trying to get the kid, so the kid doesn't get shot by the cops. So he comes out to intervene and says, he doesn't have a gun, it's a toy, he's autistic, he doesn't know what you're telling him to do. And so the cops turn their gun on him and get him to put his hands up. So he's cooperating with them, he's saying the whole time, I'm a medical professional, and he's explaining the situation. This is all on video, right? He's explaining the situation, and he's following their instructions to the letter. They get him to get down on the ground, he gets down on the ground, and even still, the cop shoots him in the leg. And as he shoots him in an interview later, they asked the man what happened, and he said, when he shot me, I yelled out, "Why did you shoot me?" And he said, and the man responded, "I don't know." He literally said, "I don't know." And I think that's a case of this, right? It's the affect on the other side, which is the racist's affective response, perhaps precedes their intellectual response, that he didn't have a reason, but he reacted that way bodily. When your finger's on the trigger, affect matters, right? What your body wants you to do or tells you to do becomes a life or death matter. So we're going in a different direction. Perhaps we can look to expansive forms, to new media, and find fresh, formal anti-racism there. So earlier in this essay, I talk a little bit about an amazing passage by James Baldwin, where he describes, there's a few where James Baldwin describes this situation of encounters with police or border agents, where he's very attentive to all of the kind of the subtext of their bodily communication. And I mean, that's done a lot of work. I think that people read black literature and have some sense of what black lives are like, and maybe become sympathetic. And there's this idea that the work we do as writers of literature is humanizing in that way, and democratic. But here's something else that made me think about it a little bit differently. So for a while I've been particularly interested in the gamification of our society, the prevalence lately of fantasy, gaming, and computer games, and alternate reality games, ludic texts, and immersive or transmedia narrative. We're living our lives more and more through multiple platforms and media forms, or with them at hand, and all these are potential sites for narrative and representation. So one example came to me as a surprise while playing a narrative computer game based on the television series The Walking Dead that struck me as surprisingly profound. So the game is animated and mostly narrative, less a game of manual response time, it's not a shoot 'em up game, more like an interactive choose-your-own-adventure type thing. It is animated, but you make choices. I'll show you in a minute. The frisson of the game is in its horror setting, but the real pressure comes ingeniously from placing you in situations of moral ambiguity and suggesting that your responses will influence relational outcomes in the game. So you influence what direction it goes by the choices you make. In this game, what is interesting is that they chose to create a black male protagonist. And so that is the character anyone playing the game inhabits. So you are this black man in the zombie apocalypse who finds a young mixed-race girl, and basically they kind of connect up, and he sort of protects her, and they sort of wander the post-apocalyptic wasteland trying to survive. And you're him making decisions that he would have to make. In the middle of one particular scene, the protagonists, so you, fall in with a group of survivors of the zombie apocalypse who are mostly white, and one of them is racist. The racist character is subtle, in a realistic way, hovering just on the edge of offense, and you must navigate your relationship with him and with these strangers that you now have to rely on to survive. So maybe we can call up the image. So this is a screenshot from the moment that shocked me. And so this is them, they're walking through the woods, and they're kind of clearing the area around where their camp is. And that's you, character named Lee Everett in the back. And the front is kind of like your one white ally in the group, in a way. He's sort of the liberal guy who's sort of aware of what's happening to him. He's kind of aware that this other character is giving you a hard time, right? And so he says so. And those are your responses that you can go with, right? So at a certain point, you're faced with the option of ignoring his mounting microaggressions and trying to remain affable, or you can blow up at him and call him out as a racist. So basically, the character says, "What's up with that guy? He really hates you. Why? What do you think is going on?" And you can say, "He's an old racist asshole," which is pretty clear. Or, "Oh, he's just looking out for his daughter," or, "He thinks I'm dangerous. I don't know why." Or, "I have no idea." Right? Feel familiar? So I played through the scene with my first response, which was basically to follow the strategy of the talk. I don't know what's going on. So, which I began with here. I kept my head down, tried to be liked, worried that the group would turn on me if I appeared aggressive. So what happened? It didn't work. He betrayed me anyway. So then I stopped the game and went back to the last point I'd saved and replayed it, right? Which you don't get to do in real life. So this time, I called him out, called him a racist, and chose the option that expressed a justified anger. Things went off in a different direction. Once you say that, you have other options, and it becomes this out loud argument with the whole group. His response and the response of the group was different, but the result was the same. He betrayed me nevertheless. Right? So at that point, I stopped the game, stunned. Not because it was an unrealistic portrayal of events, but because it was an experience of something you never get to do in real life. In real life, you often suspect a racialized encounter you are in is a no-win situation, in which your response options, measured and meek, or loud and direct, will nevertheless end with the same conclusion. But this was more than a representation of it. It was something literature doesn't do, because it was an unfolding of your own decisions. So in this scene, you're implicated for what you do in a way that one is not when you're merely reading conventional fiction. And you're shown how racism is itself a non-logical system that predetermines its conclusions, often regardless of the racialized object's actions. A white person, I realized, playing through this, might actually feel something very much approximating situations I've been in many times but find hard to describe, in which you must decide to receive the racism and eat it, or you decide to name it, and then ironically become the one associated with the social disruption you've caused by being angry. It all turns on you. So might this not open up a new kind of artistic method of replicating the experience of racialization, creating a new understanding for those who have not known it firsthand? Being, if only fleetingly, in the avatar of that black protagonist is a taste, perhaps, of the affect of racial confrontation. And so indeed, there's a whole genre coming out now of empathy games. They are designed to, they're not really a win or lose, they're designed to show you what this quandary is, whatever it may be. So that's me.
Wow. Thank you.
I want to start by saying thank you in public to this group, to Anita, for the prayer this morning. I've been having lots of trouble finding my prayer tongue. And I was able to pray as you were praying, so thank you. And also to thank Marissa and Suzette for this space and moment that we're in together. Does anybody else have the experience of going to speak to a certain group of people or a conference or whatever and realizing that you're so tight, you're so, your bones are so brittle that you feel like, you know, my arm could snap because I'm in a space that is, it's not always overtly hostile, but sometimes we are called upon to go into spaces and to speak to people who have zero ability to hear or understand what we are saying. And yet we still have chosen to go there. Nobody has forced me to be there. I have my reasons for sometimes going into those spaces. So I was sitting in my chair back there earlier today and thinking about how supple my bones felt in this space and how I was not bracing myself for my turn up here. So thank you, Suzette and Marissa. And to all my new colleagues that I've just met and old people like Wayde. People I no longer. I am really blessed and honored to be among you. So I'm going to begin, I'm going to just speak a bit of a timeline of Black presence in this place that we call Alberta now. And I'm going to begin with the arrival of my ancestors, and then I'm going to go backwards before I go forward. Some of you are familiar with the story of my ancestral migration to this part of the world, but I'll just briefly go over it. My both sets of great-grandparents as children and as young people had either been enslaved themselves or had been children of people who were enslaved in various southern American states. They then went to what was at that time known as the Western Territory and the Indian Territory, where they had pretty well full rights of citizenship until the state of Oklahoma was formed out of those territories, at which time they were attacked most vigorously. And the reasons that they had gone there in the first place, that they believed they should have a place where they could live and vote and all those things, people very much wanted to squash that belief out of them. And so they, at the time that the state was formed, the government of Canada was also advertising for people to come north. It was specifically looking for American farmers and ranchers to come north and go to the areas up in northern Alberta and Saskatchewan that were still quite heavily treed at that time, and to do their thing that they always wanted settlers and homesteaders to do up there. That's a context in which my great-grandparents arrived. They went to northern Saskatchewan. One great uncle came to Amber Valley, Alberta, which is the largest of the 5 black settlements that were created out of that movement. There is almost no family from the black pioneer community of that time who did not at that time or does not now have kin and friendships among the indigenous peoples whose land we were coming to live upon. And so a part of my talk today wants to just share a little bit about how those relationships developed as well, and how they continue to play out in my life. One of the things that was one of the first situations they encountered was a very, very hard winter. Some of the people said in their memoirs that it was 66 below at some points up there. And they were not accustomed to surviving in that kind of landscape and weather, and without access to being able to grow and cultivate the foods that they were used to. So one of the first things that they did and learned from their indigenous neighbors was how to work with the meats that were available in the area. So a lot of them learned how to smoke moose meat and cook it and that kind of thing. That was one of the first intersections. And then the Amber Valley baseball team became very famous in northern Alberta. Every little community had its baseball team, including the indigenous communities, so the First Nations and the Métis who were living in the area. And often out of those gatherings where one team would go to another team's territory and play baseball, and then there would be a big barn dance and that kind of thing. There were many friendships and relationships and romances that grew out of those encounters, and so there were many people from my ancestral community who married into the indigenous communities surrounding them. When I was growing up, I, for some reason, believed that that migration was the first large black migration into this part of the world. And it was a very private story. It wasn't something that I had access to at school. I often fully understood in my classrooms as a young child, where I would be the only black child in that classroom, I often understood, because I grew up in a very poor immigrant community, that the fact that my great-grandparents and my grandparents and my mom, not my dad, but my mom and me were, like 4 generations in this part of the world, were by far the oldest of those immigrant and settler communities, and yet our story was not at all on the table. So I wasn't learning these things at school, but I knew them, I absorbed them because it was part of my life, and I thought we were the first large migration. But as I said, I'm going to go backward and talk about how I discovered that my ancestors came into an already established community of people of African descent who had already formed their own alliances with the indigenous people that they came in among. So in 1910, when my ancestors arrived, almost all of Calgary's black citizens lived in the East Village. For a variety of reasons, including proximity to the train station where some of them were employed, safety numbers, discrimination in housing in other neighborhoods, and cheaper rents. And the size of the community is a bit difficult to pinpoint, the size of the community that my folks came into. But in 1910, there was a ball in Calgary that Calgary Herald described as the colored ball, where 150 people attended, 150 black people attended that ball. So it's got to be a pretty substantial population already if they were able to populate this dance that was held in the Eagle Hall in the Beltline. There were so many black people living in East Village that sometimes the newspapers of the time referred to it as Darktown. And they formed, the people who threw this ball was called the Colored People's Protective Association, or the CPPA, which they formed as a kind of financial and social and emotional support network, a group that people could turn to for help with housing and food and employment networking and police problems, as well as arranging those kinds of social events. A lot of the people, as I said, a lot of the men were employed as porters on the railroads. And most of the hotels in the area would not admit black people to come to the hotels and stay. And yet the porters were traveling, and they sometimes had to have a place to stay overnight. And so the Colored People's Protective Association would support business people and entrepreneurs who wanted to run boarding houses that would provide a place for the porters to stay. And yet, so two people in particular, Harry and Bertha Palmer, if you look through the newspapers of the time, their names come up again and again and again. They were arrested so many times I've lost count of how many articles I've read about their arrests. And the police would try to get them on various charges of selling liquor or running a house of ill repute. Sometimes they were acquitted, and at least one time that I know of, they were sentenced to 6 months hard labor and called evildoers by the judge, simply for running a boarding house to provide housing and a meal for the boarders who they couldn't stand up on the street corner overnight while they waited for their morning train. These boarding houses were hated so much. The police hated them, the neighbors hated them. They were called a secret society, and people said it's communism, and there seemed to be such incredible resentment around the notion of black people helping other black people out. I'm going to be speaking some names into this space, because I think this is the perfect space in which to speak these names that I hope will land on someone, and that someday someone will take up research and tell these stories that I, for sure, will not have time in my lifetime to do justice to them all. Charles Daniels was one. And when I was in Edmonton recently for my play, I was on a panel. The theater company ran an amazing series of salons after some of the shows talking about issues raised in the play. And one of the young activists that I was on a panel with, named Bashir Muhammad, who has been very involved in the conversations with the police in Edmonton around the issue of carding, mentioned this person, Charles Daniels, who he said, he was talking about how long before Rosa Parks and long before Viola Desmond, Charles Daniels took the Sherman Grand Theatre in Calgary to court for refusing him admittance. And he won his case by default when no one from the firm of Lougheed and Bennett, yes, the Lougheed we know, and yes, the Bennetts we know, they didn't appear in court to defend the case. I believe that theater was also owned by the Lougheed family. Anyway, Bashir was expressing such interest in the story, and I was thinking, I've encountered these stories in my research, and it doesn't even fully land on me how incredibly important it is that in 1914 a black man took those very powerful families to court for their inability to recognize his humanity, and won that case, albeit by default because they were too chicken to show up. But it was the CPPA, the Colored People's Protective Association, that paid for that court case, and that was a support network underneath Charles Daniels. People have always really needed each other. Other people that were on the board at that time were William King, Robert Clayton, Clayton Ford. They were all board members, and Charles Daniels was the chief inspector at the CPR. Now, within that mess of just wanting to survive and have a job and provide for your family and have a home, a roof over your head, and be a porter, and there were people within the indigenous communities surrounding Calgary and among the Chinese residents of the city who we turned to for help. So in particular, one of my favorite stories is of Hop Wo, who was the proprietor of the Crystal Cafe, and where Dick Bellamy, who was an elder in my community when I was a very young girl, said, we called him our brother, and he adapted his recipes, Chinese food recipes in his restaurant, to the tastes of the quarters, because they like, their fried chicken a certain way from the south and all that. And it was really beautiful, and there was incredible support among different marginalized groups at that time, stories that we never really had access to. So the community that John Ware's in-laws and children were interacting with was that community, the community that was there before my ancestors came. And it included Spencer and Jesse Lewis, who were Mildred Lewis Ware's brother and sister, who were very musical and often played at parties and whatnot, and their father, Daniel Vant Lewis. The Lewises were one of the few black families that did not live in the East Village. They lived in an absolutely huge mansion on the site of what is now the Westbrook Mall. It occupied a space that was almost as big as the mall. And Daniel had built it. Daniel was a carpenter. He was a very well-known carpenter in Toronto. For those of you who were here for my reading last night, when I was talking about Mildred Lewis's family, all of those things were true. Her father was a very skilled carpenter, and so he built this house because he had a big family. And then when John and Mildred died in 1905, they took in the 5 Ware children. So they all lived. They probably all had their own room. I wish you could see. I wish I had brought some slides. You could see the size of this house that Daniel had built, and that's where they lived. And one of their daughters, Mary Lewis, married William Herbert Darby, who was the first cook at the Vulcan Hotel in the very early 1900s. But I have to go back further than that and unpack the fact that the Lewises and the Wares came into an already existing community. So Dave Mills was an interpreter and trapper who was living in the area at the time, who lived on what is now the Blood Reserve with his wife, Holy Rabbit Woman was her name. And Dave Mills himself was the son of another trapper who had been here in the 1850s, prior, way before John Ware came. And Dave Mills' mother was also an Indigenous woman. So he both was the son of and the husband of an Indigenous woman. There was also Annie Saunders, who ran 3 businesses in Pincher Creek, Alberta, beginning around 1879, somewhere around there. I believe she was probably one of Alberta's, the actual province of Alberta's, the territory that we call Alberta, but that was not Alberta at that time. She was one of our first female entrepreneurs, and she successfully ran those 3 businesses. William Bond was another person who was here, and Jesse Williams, both people who were notorious in that we remember their names associated with crime. William Bond was arrested along with 4 other men who were, one was their boss was a very famous whiskey trader, and the Northwest Mounted Police was after him. And when they arrested those 5 men, William Bond was actually the only one that was taken to jail and wasn't bailed out by the real kingpins of that horrible trade, which were people down in just across the U.S. border. William Bond was not bailed out, along with the other white men with whom he was arrested, and he actually ended up dying in custody. They said that he tried to escape. His body was found in the snow, some distance away with a bullet hole in his back. So a really heavy price to pay for having happened to be the only black man in that group of people. And my understanding of his role in that group was that he was a translator and interpreter. Jesse Williams was a person who was accused, arrested, tried, and hung all on the same day for a murder that we have absolutely no way of knowing if he committed. And that happened shortly before John Ware arrived in Calgary. That is one of the reasons why John Ware hated Calgary. Was because he couldn't step foot in this little town that it was at the time without being hounded for something by police or by racist hotel owners or whatever. There were several other cowboys, black cowboys here at the time of John Ware, whose names I'm going to speak. Green Walters, Felix Luttrell, Pete Smith, Billy Welsh, Tom Robinson, George Robinson, Jim Whitford, Tom Ringgold, James Marshall, Lee Jabell, a man whose surname is Harrison, I don't know his first name. There was also a woman who was a part of that kind of cowboy and rancher community named Florence Wolfe. So When I was working on my film, one of the things I decided to do was share anecdotes about John Ware's life and have them spoken by a person who was connected in some way to my life in that story. And there is an anecdote about John Ware and the first time that he met Crowfoot, which I wanted to share in the film. And I asked my friend Michelle Thrush, who I first met when I was working on the television show North of 60 as a part of the writing team. I asked Michelle if she would share that anecdote. We went back and forth a lot because I've been very interested in that meeting between John Ware and Crowfoot. Happened in October of 1885, and it was at treaty payment time when people would go to a Blackfoot crossing and bring payments for various things. And some people would bring horses, and there would be horse races, and it was kind of a big party. But I happen to know that Crowfoot was quite elderly at that time. You know, from what I know of his life, he was sick. He must have been sick with grief. So many of his beautiful children had died from diseases that were brought to them and from various forms of the way people die because of racism. And so I was really interested in this story that I'd been told, or that I'd read so many times about John Ware, and that Crowfoot had really liked him so much that he had asked him to stay at the crossing. And I had sent Michelle the anecdote and said, you know, have you ever heard this story? Is this a story that's told in, you know, in Indigenous circles as well? And she hadn't heard the story. And I sent her the spelling of the name that John Ware was supposedly called by Blackfoot. And I found 3 different, now these are English spellings of whoever it was, whatever historian or person was writing down what they thought that name was. So I sent one, and I really apologize for my pronunciation here. I know I'm not going to get it right, but just to give you a notion of what I've read in various accounts of this meeting between them. So Saxa Nipikan was one, Matoxi Sax Napaquan, and Matoxi Sax Apiquin. And I always, what these anecdotes always said in the small little bits that they are given space to in the history books written by white settlers, was that it was translated to mean either black white man or bad black white man. And then the translator always goes on to say that what bad meant in that context was formidable or strong, not that, you know, not that he was a bad person. So Michelle, who is Cree, said there is 0 chance that I am going to try to answer this question for you, but I'm going to contact my friends who are Blackfoot, who are Blackfoot speakers and experts in the language. And that was one of the most interesting things that's ever happened to me, that I had this conversation with Michelle and with her friends who are Blackfoot around what that anecdote means, because it's an anecdote that came to us not because of something that someone from my community wrote down, nor as something that someone from the Blackfoot community wrote down, but it was a story about us, but not from us. And in the end, what Michelle and I did on camera in that situation was just talk about that intersection, and that where we are in terms of history that has been told by others about us, and our attempts to reclaim that history for ourselves and figure out what it really meant. Michelle told me that if, in fact, John Ware was given a name, there would have been a naming ceremony. There probably would have been, it probably would have been quite a lengthy process, that you didn't just, you know, that the Blackfoot didn't just slap a name on anybody that kind of walked up. And so that it would, if that anecdote is true, and if the incident that we were discussing is true, that would have been a place and time in history that I would give anything to be there for that. But I need to go further back than that even and talk about some of the work that my friend and colleague Bertrand Bickersteth has been doing to document black men who were in this part of the world going back to 1799. Three men specifically that he's uncovered: Joseph Lewis, Glasgow Crawford, and Stephen Bonga. So what I have learned is that there was an arrogance in the story that I was given, which was that we were the first black people here. We weren't. There were black people here, and that we were not the first black people who formed those relationships of kinship and friendship with the First Nations and Métis who were down in this part of southern Alberta. I'm now going to jump ahead a little bit. About how much time do I have left? Oh gosh, I haven't been watching the clock. It's been so fascinating.
We started at 1:15, right? So we're wrapping up a little bit.
Okay. Okay.
That's so hard to choose.
It really is. It's hard to choose. I think I'm going to go to the end of my presentation because I said in my abstract that I would talk about some people that I feel we need to know more about, and hopefully one of you young scholars in this room will. One of these names or stories will land with you. There were two black businesses in the East Village that I would really like somebody to write about. One was the Chicken Inn, owned by Bob Melton and Florence Carter, and the other was the Chicken Fry, owned by Luella and Dick Bellamy. Dick Bellamy is the elder I mentioned earlier who said Hop Wool was our brother, and shared stories with me about how our community was supported by the Indigenous and Chinese people who were living here at the time. Mildred Ware's family, Nettie Ware, Ethel Lewis, Spence Lewis, those are stories that need to be told. Ethel Lewis was a poet and a carpenter as well. She got her dad's carpentry skills. I know a family that owns a cabinet that she built, and I don't know how to ask them for it. If they ever get tired of it, I don't want it just to go to the auction or whatever. I'll figure it out. I guess I want to talk very briefly. I'll end by talking about Vi King, because when you read about my community, you hear three names all the time: Vi King, Oliver Bowen, and Floyd Sneed. Floyd Sneed was the drummer of the rock group Three Dog Night, and Oliver Bowen was the engineer who was the manager in the Calgary Transit at the time that the C train was first built. There's an Oliver Bowen maintenance facility named for him. These were people from my community. And I'm just going to read you Vi King's brief bio to end. Because we always read that Vi King was the first black female lawyer in Canada. But she was also the only woman in her graduating class from the Faculty of Law at the U of A in 1953. While at the U of A, she was the vice president of the Students' Union and the representative of the Students' Union to the National Federation of Canadian University Students. So this is 1953. She was one of only 4 students to receive an Executive A gold ring at the 1952 celebration of student contributions to the university. Another student who received the ring that year was Peter Lougheed. She went on to work for Citizenship and Immigration Canada before becoming the first woman named to a senior management position with the American National YMCA. So I want one of you to write the story of Vi King and Peter Lougheed meeting at university and how they might have talked about or unpacked the story of Charles Daniels and James Lougheed, Peter Lougheed's grandfather. There's a story there. Vi was also one of the best friends of my mom and a bridesmaid at both my mom and her twin sister's wedding. I'm going to conclude by saying there has existed here an invisible parallel, much more magical and interesting world than what we get from our history books. And that is a story of people of color who have come here for a variety of reasons. Some of us brought to Turtle Island against our wishes and against our will. Some of us who were here for 10,000 years. Some who were brought here to build the railroad. But a group of people who found themselves here, nevertheless, and who lived this parallel universe. It's like a fantasy novel where there's a whole other world over here that is so beautiful and so fun and so funny and so rich and so filled with, yes, with struggle, but also with music and incredible love that people who struggle have for one another. And there you go, everybody.
Bonjour, Pamo, Halito Sahochi for Open Prud'homme Cranford, Chiokla, Po Holy Sabali Portao, and Tuklo, Chukayakni, Yokoke Messi, Madam. Hi, I'm in Prud'homme Cranford. I want to give thanks to the peoples of Treaty 7, whose homelands we are on, and to say thank you for letting me live and work in your territory. I want to thank Larissa and Suzette. I want to thank everyone today. Wayde, Cheryl, David, who's already left, Chris, Nadine, and oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, Karina. I was remembering Vernon, who I've met just last night, whose work has motivated me already to think about things in new and dynamic ways, and who have made me cry multiple times today. So, if okay, Missy. I did not plan a paper. And now listening to so many fabulous things today in the first presentation, I guess I want to change up a little bit. So, originally I wanted to talk about, Nupunananoli Homalisa. Nupunananoli is to tell a story, to talk. Anupa literally is language, right? So it's in a lot of phrases. And Homalisa, Homa is red and Musa is black, right? Originally, I was thinking about my own positionality as Louisiana Creole and Choctaw Biloxi and what that means, and to be in this territory, right? As and a person of indigenous descent, but not a person indigenous to this space, right? And how we engage with that. And then thinking about the ways in which red and black lives share stories and share histories and carry those traumas together in ways that aren't always discussed or distilled, and how do we problematize that? And thinking more and listening more today, I want to talk about some issues in the States historically. I'll hit on what Louisiana Creole is, who and what freedmen are for folks who aren't familiar. And then I just want to talk maybe a little bit about and I have lots of photos so that we can problematize this idea of, what racial categorization is supposed to look like when we're talking about people who come from shared space. But more than anything, I just want us to talk about what these issues and these experiences mean. Particularly if we kind of reconfigure how we think about time, right? So if we say, if we were to take in, where I come, like an indigenous viewpoint that time, if we don't historicize, right? History, I think in a Western sense, allows us to say that, oh, well, this was here. It's not present, right? Whereas I come from a space that says, this, and this are all together, right? We're constantly in the past, present, and the future, and the ways in which tense isn't used often in language, right? It also means that you have to own where you come from. You have to consider what your relationships are and your kinships are. You have to embody trauma and triumph as opposed to push it away. So what does it do then when we start to problematize or think about these relationships in new ways? So particularly, and this plays on work that Karina and Cheryl both do and address, which is wonderful, the intersections and the shared stories that we're having. So in Oklahoma, before it was Oklahoma, it was known as Indian Territory. And what are commonly called the 5 civilized tribes, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee. And of those, the Cherokee are the only ones that are not from the Muskogean culture and language. The Cherokee are the southernmost Iroquoian stock. But all descendants of the mound builders. So the 5 civilized tribes were dubbed this because they were considered the first to adopt some of the cultures and assimilations in different ways of white folk, right, of the settlers. This included things like becoming Christian and Baptist. Some of the greatest collections of language among 5 tribes are hymnals, right? And so you go to church and you learn to sing, you know, right? So, you know, you sing Amazing Grace in Choctaw. You learn to sing it in Chickasaw, right? And that's a lot of times only language access some folks have. So that's how the name comes about. But the other thing that came about was slavery. And that's not to say that slavery didn't exist in some extent in the Americas, but I think we need to make distinctions between what we call captivity and what we call slavery, right? Because it's one thing to go to a neighboring tribe and say, hey, you killed one of ours, we're going to take one of yours, right? And the way that relationship works and how somebody earns their way into peoplehood, right? Earns a place. And so slavery functioned in different ways among the 5 civ. So there were families and clans who approached slavery very much in the sense of this captivity, right, where folks would earn a space, right, and would marry in and have children and reproduce, right, and because we're particularly for those who weren't necessarily being real Christian, or following older ways, you know, we had a polyamorous society, right? So you would have 2 wives in one household. So it wouldn't be uncommon to have a wife who was Creek and a wife who had been a black slave, right? But then in other ways, slavery did begin to take on the aspects, right, the worst aspects that we see in the American South. So it became kind of divided, right, and how, not just from tribe to tribe, but within the tribe, right, the place of black bodies, and the fact that there were red black bodies, right, that inhabited both spaces. But what became very clear was that those who had been brought in as slaves became indigenized. They know the language, they know the culture, they know the history. Right? It's also one of the reasons why, when we think of the Underground Railroad, going to the tribes was a safe space, because it was a different space. So by the time the Civil War breaks out in the U.S., there's about 10,000 slaves in ownership, right? And at the end of the Civil War, all the tribes are willing to say, hey, yeah, we'll do this, but had an issue with citizenship, because at this time, removal has happened, and of course, as Native folks were forced, right, to walk a genocidal trail out of the southeast into IT, Oklahoma, the slaves who were both red black bodies and black bodies that came with, as things began to change. Right? At the end of the Civil War, we get the rise of Reconstruction, and we get what will become, and later codified as Jim Crow law. Right. So at the end of the Civil War, this idea of who gets what, who is codified as what, right, becomes, and I'm simplifying things down just to kind of get everybody on the same level, for those not familiar, becomes at issue here. And so some tribes, were very resistant, but because a number of the 5 civilized tribes were torn during the Civil War, there were whole factions of Creeks and Seminoles with some Choctaws and Chickasaws that were known, and Shawnees that were known as Loyalists, who were Indians and red-black and slave folk who joined the Union Army and fought with Apopla Yoholo, Creek leader and warrior. And then there were other folks like a lot of people have heard the name Stan Wayde, who was a Cherokee Civil War leader and a racist MFer. Right. So it is a complicated space. It's not a unified space. But as the treaties come down to say, hey, you all weren't all on one side, so if you want to retain who you are, if you want to retain rights to the land that we've given you, we're going to enter into a treaty system. Those treaties that come about, and I'm not going to read through all this, slowly codify that not only are bodies that have been enslaved now free, but they should have citizenship and or land rights. Right? Some tribes are like, cool, half our population's mixed anyway, let's go. Other tribes are resistant. The Chickasaw notoriously refuse to ever give citizenship rights or land rights whatsoever. But once the idea of statehood or homestead, the opening up of Indian Tory comes along of Oklahoma, the notion of DAWs and enrollment becomes an issue. So at this point, at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, people come in to codify who and who is not Native, right? And it's not very similar to what Cheryl was saying. It was not our community saying who we are. It was somebody else coming in to decide who we are, predominantly based on phenotype. So you can see folks on the DAWS rolls listed as, people, 2 same parents, siblings, one listed as 3/4 Creek, and another listed as 1/8, right? And then maybe somebody else who's their first cousin is a freedman, right? Because it's codified in this sense. And of course, by this time we have in the States this idea of hypo-descent and Jim Crow, right? And as I like to say, as Andrew Jolivet likes to point out, right, the idea of the Indian problem is still very rampant at this point in time, coming out of the Civil War and going into the Progressive era. The Progressive era in the States is littered with this idea of the vanishing Indian. Right? The idea that the Indian is going to die out. So it's bad enough we have to deal with the Indians. Who wants to acknowledge that we have Black Indians too? That means we just upped our issue, right? We've just upped our problem, right? Not only do we have former slaves, right, and that to deal with, but then former slave bodies who have indigenous rights to the land as well. it really complicates the situation. And the easiest thing to do is to say, oh, there's blackness, you can only, and bifurcate, right? And this bifurcation comes around. And we notice that in any bifurcation, whether we're talking about Canada or the US, right? It's a black-white binary. Chris pointed that out earlier. And black-white binaries make no space for indigeneity. It's an automatic erasure of indigenous peoplehood. So, as folks get delineated, in 1907, over 300 members of the Choctaw and Chickasaw Freedmen sue the tribes and the United States, saying, and bring testimonials, right? And genealogical evidence to say we should be marketed as Chickasaw and Choctaw by blood, not freedmen, we have rights, right? And ask for the 1866 treaties to be upheld. All right, and ultimately, if you click, there's going to be two images that come up. I highlighted my ancestors' names. So, and still, what came back was no. And the 300 plaintiffs were left on the freedmen rolls. This idea, and if you click just on a lot of pages, if we look at the roles, we'll see, right, this idea of same families, same people, same towns who come up being delineated, some as by blood, some by freedmen. You can hit, which what it does is it erases this idea of kinship, these shared histories and trajectories of both trauma and triumph and survival. The one image on the side is a Creek woman there's no designation whether or not but it looks pretty much like a mother and child to me making sofki, right? And so when we think about the Dawes roles, we know that the mother would be codified as Indian and the child would be codified as freedman. This is a picture of a Creek homestead, which historically, and I've spent time in Oklahoma and wading through the archives, and when you get up close, some are have been racialized out. Some who phenotypically want to be read, if you're going to believe in that concept of phenotype, as black, and some that are going to be phenotypically read as Indian. And of course, the photograph has been codified in the archive as a Creek homestead with freedmen. But it looks like a family to me, right? So in November of 2017, this year, after a decades-long fight, the Cherokee freedmen finally won the right to full citizenship of the tribe. Right? And so we know this has been going on for a very long time. Back in Oklahoma, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek are getting ready to begin legal battles for recognition for their treaty rights to be reinstated as well. This is another picture of Creek freedmen right before allotment. So how does that connect to other Black Indian identities? So, I'm particularly invested, coming from a Louisiana Creole and a Choctaw Biloxi family, on how we talk about this. So, there's been, particularly by non-Creole folk, right? Anne Rice, True Blood. Just get out of Louisiana already. Y'all don't know what you're talking about. Just move on. This idea that Creole is black and white, or Creole is French and African, right? And that's all it is. But Creole means different things, based on land base, right? Because Haitian Creole and Louisiana Creole are not mutually intelligible. Our Louisiana Creoles sometimes have Haitian Creole descent, damn Skippy, right? And a Cubano descent. But it's its own thing. So Louisiana Creoles are a Métis or Mestizo group that rise up out of Mestizaje, right? And are intergenerationally, culturally, a product of tribes specifically connected to Louisiana, right? French and Spanish and African and Afro-Caribbean. And when I say Afro-Caribbean, like when I write stuff, you'll see in my footnotes, I specifically mean Afro-Indigenous Caribbean, right? That tres raíces of what is Latinidad, right? So that means we're post-contact Indigenous communities, right? And these post-contact Indigenous communities, we recognize the totality of where we come from, that we are Choctaw and Quapaw and Caddo and West African and Spanish and French, but we're our own thing, right? And we have our own culture, our own peoplehood, right? Our own peoplehood, which means we're connected to our own land base, we have our own communities, we have our own language called Imini, right? We have our own ceremonial cycles, resistance to political occupation, and continue to intermarry from Creole community to Creole community to Native community to back to Creole community. So that kinship remains intact. So if you hit one. So this is a picture of tribes in Louisiana. We actually have a lot, y'all. And now, so if you get a sense of where the tribes are located by parish and by location, if you hit again, this is considered a map of where the Creole parishes are. If you hit one more time, you'll see there is an overlap. And I haven't actually gone in yet and put like, here's Cane River, look, it's smack dab next to, right? And so you see that the communities border up against and show this history of kinship between tribal space and Creole space, right? So that if you're an Opelousas if you're an Opelousas Creole or Cane River Creole or Point Coupee Creole, you marry back and forth, but you also intermarry with a Takapa and Tunica Choctaw, Biloxi, and Homa, because those are your communities. And for a lot of families, right, the idea of introducing non-indigeneity, right, non-red blackness didn't happen until the 50s, 60s, 1970s. So, you know, when I say I go home, I'm related to everybody, I go home, I'm related to everybody. Creoles as well, right, some came to Oklahoma and were removed, right, and then categorized. And because this categorization relied on phenotype, and because Creoles could fit any phenotype, from whiteness to Indianness to blackness, were codified in different ways with removal, right? So like, you know, my Prud'homme ancestors, one brother is codified as Indian and gets his allotment. The other goes back home to Louisiana, but are counted in the census. Right? So it might be counted as a census in Oklahoma as Indian or freedmen, and then come back to Louisiana at the same time during the Progressive Era, where there's only two choices: white or black. It's a bigger picture of the census. So this is just a barrage of pictures. You can just hit them. It's like, what? Founding members of the Cane River Creole community, to displace how we think of racialization and phenotype and understand it through a cultural context, right? Because we're talking about culture, we're not talking about Western hierarchical concepts of race. I love standing between my brother cousins. Right? Creoles still do blanket ceremonies and water ceremonies, right? No. So, can look anyway. So, misspelling. So black plus Indian equals Blendian, which is the term we use, right, in Oklahoma and Louisiana. So you can fast forward through the pictures, because I just kind of want to get to right? This idea, and that, you know, we're still engaging in cultural continuity. So this takes us back to what Cheryl was saying. So right, in 1897 and 1911, Clifford Sifton, who was a Canadian Minister of Interior, recruited people from Europe and the United States to come to the prairies. And so, because Jim Crow had become so problematic in Oklahoma, and because, frankly, the Dawes had screwed people over, based on these concepts and these systems, in Oklahoma, freedmen had formed communities because they'd been pushed out, they'd been detribalized, right, and pushed out. And then other African American former slaves who came into Indian territory. So freedmen and African American Indian communities created communities next to each other. And in some of these places in Oklahoma, they're called sunset towns. And so as racism continued to grow, racism against Native folk, racism against Black folk, and certainly racism and disenfranchisement against red-Black folk, this idea of moving, right, this migration is another northern migration. So Black folk come to Canada, right? So more than 1,000 African American people migrated to Alberta or Saskatchewan, according to the Oklahoma Historical Archive. But what I want to pose, and I want us to think about in trouble, and what I'm trying to find language to talk about, is what does it mean when we consider the history of freedmen in Oklahoma? And the folks who were of freedmen descent who came to Alberta and came to Saskatchewan, right? What is it, and this is part of the question that I asked earlier today, what is it about this bifurcation that allows for the erasure of indigeneity and is particularly kind of hell-bent on erasing red-Black indigeneity and kinship, right, from the conversation? And how do we begin to talk about that? And how do we begin to have those conversations and allow space for families to come home? And acknowledge that, and I think, Nadine, you said that resonates so much with me, right? That idea that, and I say to my students too, right, our families are here with us, right? You know, whether they've walked into, you know, what we would call the third world or not, right? They're here, their lessons are here, and I imagine them holding that culture, just waiting for us to say, we still have it. So how do we make that exchange? But how do we make people listen? So it's just thoughts, and how do we address it? Where do we begin? How do we advocate?
We have some time for questions. And perhaps I'll do what Suzette did earlier this morning and open up the panel first. See if there's discussion amongst yourselves that makes sense to have. And then I'll open it to you. I mean, it seems to me that in particular there's connection between Cheryl and Rain. I'd be curious to hear how you draw that together. If there's language for that. 'Cause I don't know if there is.
Yeah, I think it would begin with, I love nothing better than looking at lists of names, where people were actually named, and I would just love to look over those names and see if there are any names I recognize. That would be the beginning of the conversation for me.
Right. Did you recognize any names when Rain showed a couple of losses? And they went by very quickly.
Yeah, very good.
I couldn't see.
I think the main ones on there that I had today were Colbert, Cole, Barnett, Brunner. The Colberts, Coles are from the Choctaw. The Barnett and Brunners are from the Creek.
Well, I would start with the Creek rosters because that was what we were told in our family was a part of our heritage.
Cheryl, you mentioned a name when you were naming people here in Calgary, and I think it's Dave Mills.
Dave Mills.
Yeah, so Dave Mills actually has descendants in Siksika who were originally from the Blood Reserve, where I'm from, Ganya. There's quite a big Mills family there, and they're recognized as 100%.
Yeah, I've spoken on the phone to Judy.
Okay.
No, I'm trying to remember. She was, I was told she was, she told me she was a descendant of Henry and Dave Mills, but I'm trying to remember what her surname was. I think it was Curly Ryder.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
she was adopted into that family.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, well, you're familiar with the 60s school. I think it has something to do with that.
Okay.
And there's another family actually who's kind of, nobody really talks about it, but it's mentioned in one of Hugh Dempsey's books. You know, our past chief, the Weaselhead family?
The Weaselheads? No, I don't know.
Well, he was the past chief, that family. Apparently what happened is this girl was with a black man and she had a baby. And the parents were disgraced because she wasn't married. So they left the baby on a wagon path that was well traveled. And so this family came along who just happened to be childless and they took this baby and raised it. But if you look at the family, there's definitely features that are distinguishable.
When was that happened?
Jeez, I'll have to think about it. But apparently this woman actually is a descendant of my great-grandfather, Fred Pace, who was Northwest Mounted Police / whiskey trade.
There's a complex. One of the things I discovered going back so far into such deeply buried archives is that there was unquestionably in my mind a pattern that was the ultimate result of it was supposed to have been genocide. And one of the things Canadians like to say to ourselves and to each other is that this was not a genocide, but when you look back at how the waves of first the fur traders and then the whiskey traders, and then after the whiskey traders the Northwest Mounted Police came in to, clean everything up, and then after that came the homesteaders, and it's just and then when the homesteaders came, they wanted to, they really wanted to move the indigenous people off the land. So you read about these rail cars that are sent through with tourists who have paid huge money to just sit in a train car and shoot buffalo indiscriminately just to destroy them, so that to starve people off of the land, so that then they would become dependent upon the beef that were being raised by those ranchers that they brought in. Like, there's no question about it. When you see wave after wave of planned destruction of people, it's pretty plain.
Well, not only that, separating us by country, because the majority of our population are actually in Montana.
Right,
So
that arbitrary border.
yeah, but the United States government recognizes us as dual citizens, but of course we have to apply. So we signed the Langley Treaty with the US government. And then, I think I sent you, there's a little bit of history on that.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Yes, you did, yeah.
And then they put the 49th parallel in, and then a man by the name of Ora Card, which was a Mormon, came across the border and asked our chief if he could settle there because it was winter time. So our chief thought, well, he's got a bunch of kids and it's really cold. I think the decent thing to do is let him stay. And 150 years. But the government wanted that buffer because he was scared that we would make a war, I guess. So that's why that section there is settler section. And then ours starts again. Actually, it should be, like the Mohawk, it should be continuous
Yeah.
Blackfoot territory.
That's how the Black Pioneer descendants feel about the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, because we had our two really main settlements in Saskatchewan, and then the 4 in Alberta, but we were one community, like we weren't thinking, so people will often ask me if I'm a descendant of Amber Valley, and I do claim that descendancy because we were just a group, we were one people. And that border really didn't have any meaning for us. I thought you were all amazing, given that this is the after-lunch panel. Everybody's digesting.
Very captivating. I have a question. I'm sorry, I forget your name for the first speaker. Wayde. I thought it was really interesting how you wove together like the story of your father and this video game you were playing. Can you actually open that again? Because I wanted to ask if you had tried the other options. Like, did you try? He's just looking out for his daughter. Because I wonder if that one kind of expresses. I'm not sure exactly of the story, but it seems to kind of express some kind of like sympathy or empathy for this like racist character, and I wonder if that would be doing something similar to like what your father was doing by just like interrupting this determination of like the story of racism, for example.
I went in the first case with the bottom one.
Yeah.
And then the second time I played through, I went with the top. So
Yeah.
the other ones. But yeah, I should have also added too that what's interesting is that you have to make a choice quickly. Like
Yeah.
It's animated, so it's happening. And then that pops up as a choice. He says something, and then that pops up as a choice of what you can say. But you've got 3 seconds to
Yeah,
decide which
like
one.
real life. Yeah.
So it really brings out your automatic response.
Just
Yeah.
like in real life.
Just like
Exactly.
If you don't hit anything, there's silence, and they respond to that. And that's a certain response, right? So.
Interesting.
I guess I'm equally afraid about he's just looking out for his
Yeah.
daughter. In terms of race and ideas of white femininity and white women's protection, like I'm like that's another trigger finger response as well. That is that I know white feminists have to struggle with around what it means to be a reason to legitimately kill and gun down black people or racialized people. So that's a big one. I think that Wayde, I'm so glad you said that the silence is an option, but not a space to breathe. Actually, there's
They'll
no
respond
time.
they'll be like, why didn't you say anything? And
I'm interested in how the algorithms of this was set. Like that silence to me indicates some algorithm, like something where the system makes a decision about what it goes through next. Anyway, that's a whole other
But the
conversation.
cleverness of the game is, I don't think there are too many branches, because that makes the game super complex.
Right.
So there are definitely cases where, without spoiling it, say this kind of thing will happen. Like there's a case where it's a zombie apocalypse story. So if a zombie bites, so somebody gets bitten, you have the choice whether to cut their arm off or not, right? and you can, so if you cut their arm off, what happens is the zombie disease still manifests and they die, right? But if you don't cut their arm off, the zombie disease manifests and they die, but then you feel like, I should have cut their arm off. I was weak, I didn't do the thing I had to do, and so it weighs on your mind. So that's how the game kind of works, is it really plays with your sense of the decisions that you made, when often they would just end up in the same branch, right?
Interesting.
So it's a kind of puts you through the ringer.
Yeah.
I played that game and I went on the internet to see if had I made another choice or something different, and it wasn't, and I was very sad.
Right.
Do
Yeah.
you know if the game maker was black? Is black?
I don't know. No, I don't know. That's a good question. But it's fascinating too, because I know someone who is teaching sort of an excerpt from this essay in class where she's partly teaching gaming, and so one of her students had a reaction to it that I hadn't noticed, and so she played through the game, and her response is, there's another interesting dynamic, is that when the apocalypse is breaking out and people are dying and turning into zombies, and then he stumbles upon a backyard, and there's a girl who's hiding somewhere, but she's talking to him, trying to get him to go away, and he's sort of trying to figure out where she is or what's going on. And eventually they sort of befriend each other, and he ends up protecting her. She's mixed race, so he goes in the house and sees a picture of her parents, and they're dead, right? They've been zombified. So he cares for her through the rest of it. And so there's that whole negotiation that's going on. You're making the decision of what you do, girl. But this student pointed out that that also softens him, because when he comes into one area where it's a white farmer who decides to take him in, he's super suspicious of you, but seeing that you have this kid, he says, well, you have your daughter here, so I guess you're going to be okay, right? And then you have this decision whether you disclose, well, she's not actually my daughter, she's just some random girl I picked up, which is going to make you or you can say, yeah, she's my daughter, thanks for letting us stay. It's full of these choices.
Wow.
Hmm.
I saw Karina's hand.
Oh, I just had a question about how, Wade, do you know if there are other games that invite participants to have a black avatar in this way? Like, is this a thing?
Not that I know, but I know it's happening now that there's these games that are coming out that are called empathy games, that are sort of based on this. And there's another one called Papers, Please, where you're a border guard, and you're this border guard, and you're making decisions as to whether you're going to let people through, and they're telling you their sob stories, and you're in this kind of fictionalized country. But if you let them through, you can get caught, and if you get caught enough times, you get penalized, and you're poor. At the end of the day, you go back home, and it tells you how much money you have, which is kind of based on the decisions you've made. It's another just emotionally terrorizing game. The first time I played that through, I was like, everybody's in. Everybody got fired. Right? My family died of starvation. And there's a resistance, and they show up and they say, like, we're the resistance, and the same thing, but if you want to help us out, you can do this. And now I have to figure out if I'm going to join the revolution.
It seems to me that this whole question of recursivity, like there's something really both productive and unsettling about it, in that sense that, what you were already talking about, if the track of the story returns you to the same terrible end regardless of your choice.
Mm-hmm.
But there must surely be games or versions of some games where it goes that way, where whether it's true for, I guess.
Well, that's like Paper Please is definitely that.
Right.
It's much more. But you don't know how many branches there are. How many things are just whatever decision you make is going to go to the same place. You're going to feel different about how you got to the same place. Because you're not sure it might change.
Right. I mean, I just wonder in terms of, the way that we read and the way, insofar as narrative works as allegory, and there's a real world referent, what the possibilities are through these games, we're thinking of moving ourselves into better places. I just recently supervised a dissertation that was a choose your own adventure. It wasn't a game. It was a novel. And we had a long discussion about who ultimately, where the agency actually lies in terms of when you're playing the game, and came to the conclusion that the agency is in the hand of the game writer, but not the player, because you do have these, even though there's multiple possible endings, they're already determined for you. You have no actual creative agency. You can make a choice. If a choice is a false choice, a coping types of choice, right? In this case, it's just interesting to think
It
about.
just depends how much it tugs on your feeling. Like, that's the thing with this game that I was playing, where
Yeah.
it's well done. So you quickly, I quickly was like, gotta survive. I gotta keep this girl alive. And you're playing this thing, and you're doing things that you feel wrong, and it just weighs on you. You're like doing the wrong decision.
There's a hand up back here.
Oh.
I did a Google search. The game was developed and published by Telltale Games. They had 6 directors and 3 writers, all of whom were white men.
Nadine.
I kind of had a question for both Rain and Cheryl. It's something I'm thinking through, and Wayde also thinking on your work on Wogan's Alley. So I'm thinking about these questions of crossing back and forth, right? Just to think on borders. And a friend of mine who's white and is pretty amazing ongoing work as an ally is writing a thesis on that shift in the moment when Vancouver City starts to clean itself up, right? So we know that mining frontier operations really require sex workers, to keep the men like still and quiet. So this is really about class, right? And like how, sometimes our stories come forward and they're very sanitized, right? Around what people do. I call it informal economies personally from my own Caribbean background, like hustling, making do. And so I guess I'm interested in, because some of the story work with Karen Ferguson's work, of course, is that there is way more turning away of Black people around BC, right? So I'm thinking about how is this, we're talking about West, how is this possibly different in Alberta? Like what, at some point maybe need to sit down and have this conversation about this borderline that runs and whether things are different. But I also I'm interested in what we're thinking about around the stories that make empathy from white people, around our legitimacy, and then the stories that we know around what work we do or what things we do that are deeply class-based or not necessarily middle class. So for example, I am middle class raised by working class people, so that's always very interesting because I betray my middle classness often because of my grandparents, so I'm not reliable. Around middle classness, I'm not, right? I am, but I'm not reliable. So the question here, and I work in the downtown east side with Black people that, like, you don't see anywhere else that are living, like elders, you name it, that are living in the city and don't make it out to events around Blackness. They're part of a different community than the ones that we're memorializing. So I'm just asking what we're thinking through around class and passing. There's a bunch of things. I could just say passing, and we could interpret it around class, we could interpret it around race and phenotype. If you want to give a vignette around, like, just when you're going through the archive, what you're thinking through in terms of what we recover, and what we hold and what we ask our children to hold as equally valued family members. Because I know class mix is what happens in my family on both sides. And so that's a really big one. So I'm just wondering how we complicate our stories. It's not just about race, but we were thinking deeper around gender, certainly, and David's piece around was just amazing, but also class. If folks might want to answer that, however you wish to do so.
That's a fantastic question.
said to, I can't remember if I said it to Suzette or Larissa earlier, that every person on the panel this morning, and I feel that way about Wayde and Rain as well, could just sit here and spend the whole day talking about these things and talking about questions like that. It's a really good one. I guess there is a space that some of us occupy where there is a different perspective on class and color and race and the impact of that on our lives. And I think that lives in the space I was talking about, the parallel world. I hope I'm answering your question correctly as what I heard you asking. So when I look at the archive and I think about what I want to bring forward, the question of class often does come up for me personally because of my background as being poor and having all kinds of impacts of racism on my life that are related to class and poverty and that kind of thing, but no longer occupying that space anymore. It's a space that I come from, but I think it's kind of what you're talking about. And so who do I recognize, or whose stories really call to me when I look through the archives, and what do I want my kids to hold, and how do I want my kids to hold their blackness when they don't read as black to anybody else in the world except for black people always know they're black. And a black man on the street or a black woman on the street knows my kids are black, but most of the world doesn't see them that way. And so how do I want them to hold their blackness when I made the choice to bring them in the world, having zero idea of what color they would be, because my grandfather, my mom's dad, he has a very complicated heritage, and I think I really need to investigate that whole freedman side thing concerning my grandfather's mother. But because he looked white, except for his hair, so if he was wearing a hat, people read him as white, and if he really strongly needed to identify as black, instead of passing to white, he was desperate to pass for black, And so the whole notion of class and color and race and all of that is embodied in my family and is very complex. And so I always try to, when my daughters would hesitate to identify as black because they didn't want to take up space when they know that they experience white privilege, even though they identify so strongly with their African heritage. I would always talk to my kids about their great-grandfather, my grandfather, and how he was the same color as them. But he lived his whole life in a space that was occupied by blackness only, as best he could, as much as he was able to control. I'm rambling because it's just such an amazing question, and I feel like I could talk all day about it.
We'll be careful later, no problem.
I think, particularly there's been, when I think of Native folk in the Southeast, and I think of Creole folk in Louisiana, class has played quite a role in how folks disenfranchised and committed lateral violence on each other. And I know it's the things that I'm not supposed to talk about, but I talk about it. So that, you know, the idea of passé blanc, and as someone who can passé blanc, right, in either my Choctaw Biloxi community or my Creole community. And I don't see them as separate communities because they're kinship. You know, they have a history of intermarriage. They share land base. That, you know, talking about class and colorism and these issues, to me are similar to talking about the ways in which Jim Crow laws were institutionalized, right? They were worked by settler colonial notions of power and privilege to help divide and separate people of color. And by dividing and separating people of color in different ways, folks who were already marginalized felt like there was agency when there wasn't agency. And I see that particularly in Creole histories. And then animosity too, right? For Creoles who were slave owners, right? And going through the archive and seeing things like, here's my grandmother, you know, great-great-grandmother. Oh, yay, she got manumission. Oh, from my other cousin's grandmother. Right? And it's intensely personal and painful. And when I look at, I have 10 younger nieces and nephews and 10 older nieces and nephews, we made babies. I can't, but everybody else made sure we made babies. And the ways in which, when I was challenged, how can you claim both? That my nieces and nephews unanswerably claim their space and never feel like they're imposing or taking up space. And it took me till I was in my 20s to claim, you know, to get over having to explain my space. They don't even, you don't get it, they just move on. You know, I'm like 9, 10 years old, you know. But I also feel that, and I talked about this the other day in the decolonizing the dissertation, I think because I do have white privilege, white skin privilege, right? That folks, we tend as a human species to find something that relates us to each other. I mean, it's what we do as tribal people, right? How am I related to you? What is my kinship to you? Who are you? Where do you come from? Are we related at some point? Do we know someone in common? And you form that kinship bond, right, through relationshipality. And I think even folks that don't grow up in that mindset do it unconsciously because you try to find something that makes you comfortable that you relate to about someone. Yeah, we both like Battlestar Galactica. Or, I don't know, you like pickled okra? I like pickled okra. Right? And for someone like me who's a light person, right, I make settlers comfortable. Which means that where somebody else who does not look like me may be further disenfranchised. It doesn't matter that people may not read my Indianness or my blackness or my queerness or anything else on the surface, right? I have every more obligation to tell those stories that aren't told and to give them to the communities that they belong to. And if I'm not giving them to my communities, then why am I doing what I'm doing?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that, we'll have to call this panel to a close, but thank you, all three, Wayne, Cheryl, Wayde, so very much. Those were really terrific. Thank you. So we're going to launch straight into the third panel.